So, you want to own a medieval castle. Stone walls rising 60 feet over the countryside. A banner snapping from the highest tower. Peasants doffing their caps as you ride through your own gatehouse. Here's a real number. When Edward I of England built Beaumaris Castle in Wales, starting in 1295, the surviving royal accounts record a total spend of somewhere around £15,000 before the project was abandoned, unfinished, because the crown ran out of money. £15,000. In an economy where a skilled master mason earned roughly 3 or 4 pence a day. Do that division, and you're looking at a single building project that swallowed more than 1 million working days of a skilled craftsman's labor, and it still never got finished. Somebody had to raise that money, feed that workforce, and defend that investment for the rest of their life. This is what owning a castle actually looked like from the inside, not the storybook version, the Exchequer's version. So let's build one from the foundation up and follow the silver until it runs out. Start with the man who ran out of it. Edward I built a ring of castles across newly conquered Wales in the late 13th century. Beaumaris, Conwy, Carnarvon, Harlech, and the surviving pipe rolls, the crown's own financial accounts, record wages paid to stonemasons, quarrymen, carpenters, and diggers by the thousand, week after week, for years. At Carnarvon alone, accounts show payments to a workforce that at peak periods numbered over 3,000 men in a single season. This wasn't a king building a home. It was a king running the largest construction employer in Britain, and even a king with the wealth of England behind him eventually had to stop paying the bills. Now be precise about what you're buying, because castle hides an enormous range of buildings under one word. There's the simple motte and bailey, an earthen mound with a wooden tower, cheap and fast, the kind Norman lords threw up across England within a few years of 1066, specifically because it could be built quickly by unskilled labor. There's the stone keep, a serious, permanent tower fortress. And there's the full concentric castle, walls within walls, the Beaumaris and Carnarvon style, the most expensive fortification technology medieval Europe ever produced. You are not buying a motte and bailey. Everyone who could afford better upgraded, and by the 13th century, the wooden castle was already what a poor lord built because he had no choice. You're buying something in the stone keep, to modest concentric range. And even that modest range will consume a fortune most noble families never fully recovered from: the money. English medieval accounts run through pounds, shillings, and pence. 12 pence to a shilling, 20 shillings to a pound. But the ruler that actually means something is the same one we've used before: a skilled craftsman's daily wage, roughly 3 to 4 pence for a master mason in the 13th century, less for an unskilled laborer. Everything in this episode converts to working days, because a pound sounds small until you realize it represents 60 to 80 days of a master craftsman's entire livelihood. Building the walls starts with the stone, and stone was never local convenience, it was logistics. Carnarvon's accounts show stone shipped by sea from quarries along the coast because nothing suitable existed near the build site, and Beaumaris required timber hauled from as far away as Liverpool. You are not simply digging a hole and stacking rock. You're running a supply chain across a hostile, half-conquered landscape, paying for ships, carts, oxen, and the armed guards needed to make sure a shipment of cut stone worth a fortune in labor actually arrived instead of being ambushed on the road. Then comes the labor itself, and this is where the numbers stop sounding medieval and start sounding industrial. Building accounts for Edward's Welsh castles list master masons earning around 3 to 4 pence a day, but they also list the small army beneath them: quarrymen cutting the stone, hewers shaping it, layers setting it, along with carpenters, smiths, and diggers, plus laborers doing the exhausting, unskilled work of hauling material up scaffolding day after day for a fraction of a mason's wage. At Beaumaris, in a single peak season, the accounts record wage payments to well over 1,000 men simultaneously. Every one of those men needed to be paid weekly, without fail, because a medieval construction workforce that didn't get paid simply walked off the site. And there are surviving records of exactly that happening on royal projects when funds ran short. Add the specialists you can't skip. A master mason architect, effectively your chief engineer, commanded wages far above an ordinary craftsman and was often shared between projects because there were only so many men in the kingdom who actually knew how to design a fortification that would survive both a siege and 100 English winters. Master James of St. George, the architect behind most of Edward's Welsh castles, was paid a substantial daily rate, specifically because his design expertise was irreplaceable, the medieval equivalent of a specialist you can't simply substitute with cheaper labor, no matter how tight the budget gets. Now, the staff who live there after construction construction ends, because a finished castle is not a finished expense. A constable runs the garrison day to day, often for a substantial annual fee that itself represented a meaningful chunk of a lesser lord's total income. Men-at-arms and archers hold the walls, paid wages that scale with how much danger the region is actually in, higher on a contested border, lower in settled country. A steward manages the household accounts, because a castle full of soldiers, servants, and stored provisions is, functionally, a small, self-contained economy that needs someone keeping the books. And a garrison, unlike a besieging army, cannot simply disband when the harvest comes in. It sits there, drawing wages, every single week, whether an enemy is anywhere near the county or not. Feeding this operation is its own quiet drain, and the historical logic behind castle design makes this brutally clear. Every castle worth building included storage for grain, salted meat, and ale sufficient to survive a siege of months, which meant that even in peacetime, in years when no enemy came within 100 miles, you were still purchasing and rotating through enough food to feed a small town, because the entire strategic value of the building depended on those stores never running critically low. So by now you've spent more than 1 million working days on stone alone, paid a specialist architect a premium salary, kept over 1,000 men employed for years, and you haven't collected a single rent yet. Time to see how a castle actually earns. The first stream is the obvious one, the land itself. A castle sat at the center of an estate, and that estate generated rent from tenant farmers, income from mills the lord controlled and charged fees to use, and revenue from local courts where the lord, or his steward, collected fines for settling disputes. The castle wasn't the income source. It was the fortified headquarters protecting the actual income source, which was every farm, mill, and market for miles around. The second stream is control of movement itself. Many castles sat deliberately on river crossings, mountain passes, or major roads, and lords with the legal right to do so charged tolls on goods passing through their territory. A castle guarding a bridge or a valley wasn't just defending land, it was a toll booth with battlements, and merchants had little choice but to pay whatever the local lord demanded if the alternative route added days to their journey. The third stream is the market itself. Many castle-holding lords secured a royal charter, granting them the right to hold a market or fair in the settlement growing up in the castle's shadow. And that charter was worth real money, because every stall, every transaction, every visiting merchant paid fees that flowed directly to the lord who'd secured the legal right to host commerce in the first place. The castle's very presence, its garrison providing security, and its lord providing legal order, was what made merchants willing to trade there rather than somewhere less protected. The fourth stream is the one every documentary skips: royal service and prestige income. Holding a castle on behalf of the crown, particularly a border or coastal fortress, often came with a royal stipend for maintaining the garrison, and a lord trusted with a strategically vital castle gained access to royal favor, court appointments, and marriages that brought in dowries and land grants worth far more than any single year's rent roll. The castle itself might run at a loss. The political capital it generated could still make you one of the richest men in the kingdom. Add the streams together: rent from the estate, tolls on the roads, fees from the market, and royal favor flowing from strategic trust, and the castle stops looking like a fortress that happens to sit on some land. It starts looking like what it actually was: the secured headquarters of a small regional government that happened to also double, when necessary, as the most expensive piece of defensive architecture money could buy. Now here's what breaks it. The first threat is the one every castle was built to survive, and most never actually faced directly: siege. A prolonged siege was catastrophic for both sides, but for the castle's owner, every week under blockade meant burning through stored food reserves that had taken years to accumulate, while earning zero income from an estate the enemy now controlled the roads to. Historians studying siege warfare note that most sieges actually ended not through storming the walls, brutally expensive in lives, but through starvation, negotiation, or the besieging army simply running out of money first, which meant the entire multi-decade investment in a castle's defenses came down to a horrifyingly simple contest: whoever's supplies and finances lasted longer. The second threat is maintenance, relentless and unglamorous. Stone walls exposed to weather for decades needed constant repair. Roofs leaked, mortar crumbled, and towers that seemed eternal from a distance required ongoing masonry work that never fully stopped, a permanent tax on ownership that showed up in estate accounts for generations after the original construction bills were paid. The third threat is obsolescence, and this one eventually ended the entire business model. Gunpowder artillery, improving steadily through the 14th and 15th centuries, made traditional high stone walls increasingly vulnerable to cannon fire in a way no amount of medieval engineering had anticipated. anticipated, because those walls were designed to resist scaling ladders and battering rams, not sustained bombardment by iron shot. Castles that had stood as unassailable statements of power for 200 years found themselves militarily outdated within a single lifetime, their walls no longer a guarantee of safety, but simply very expensive stone. The fourth threat is the crown itself. Kings who granted lords the right to build and garrison castles could also, when politically convenient, order those same castles slighted, deliberately destroyed, to prevent a rebellious noble from using his own fortress against royal authority. Owning the most formidable building in your county made you powerful right up until the moment it made you a threat. And English and French history alike are full of once mighty castles reduced to rubble on royal order, the owner's fortune poured into stone that the crown then paid to have torn back down. So, knowing all of it, the million working days at Beaumaris, the 1,000-man payroll, the siege stores, the crumbling mortar, was this ever a good business? Run the good years first. You hold a well-positioned castle on a river crossing with a royal market charter, steady tolls, dependable rents, and a crown that values your loyalty enough to keep the royal stipend flowing for your garrison. No siege ever actually reaches your walls, because the reputation of a well-defended castle often did more work than the walls themselves, deterring attacks that never had to be fought. A good castle, run well, over a long, peaceful stretch, could make a noble family genuinely wealthy for generations, its cost amortized over decades of steady rent, tolls, and market fees. Now the bad years. A rival claims your river crossing and diverts trade around your tolls entirely. A prolonged siege drains your stores in a single, brutal season, and you surrender not because your walls fell, but because your treasury did. Gunpowder artillery arrives at your gates 100 years after your grandfather built the walls, and the fortress that was supposed to be eternal falls in an afternoon. Or your family backs the wrong side in a succession dispute, and the crown you once served orders your own castle demolished, stone by stone, at your own family's expense. That's the honest ledger behind the battlements and the banner. Not a story about lords ruling from unassailable stone, but a story about a family that sank a fortune of working days into walls meant to outlast them, and spent every generation after betting that the tolls would keep flowing, the harvest would keep coming, and the crown's favor would outlast the next war. In a business that made some families dynasties and left just as many holding nothing but very expensive, very defensible rubble.